Victoria Green stood in front of the full-length mirror, admiring her reflection. The custom-made wedding dress fit perfectly on her slim figure, with tiny crystals catching the light as she moved. At 27, she was about to marry into one of the most respected families in the city. Her fiancé, Robert Wilson, was handsome, successful, and came from old money. Everything Victoria had always wanted. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Miss Green?" asked the wedding planner, hovering nearby with a clipboard. "The flowers in the entrance hall need to be changed," Victoria said without looking away from her reflection. "I specifically asked for white roses, not those cheap-looking lilies." The wedding planner nodded quickly. "I'll take care of it right away." Victoria's wedding was taking place at the Wilson family's country estate, a sprawling property with manicured gardens and a view of the lake. The ceremony would be held outdoors, followed by a reception for 300 guests in the grand ballroom. No expense had been spared. The cake alone cost $5,000. While the final preparations were underway, Victoria decided to inspect the ballroom one more time. Her high heels clicked against the marble floor as she walked through the hallway, mentally checking off items from her list. Everything had to be perfect. Her friends would be watching, and she wanted them to be jealous. When Victoria entered the ballroom, she noticed an older black woman cleaning the floor in one corner. The woman wore a simple gray uniform with the catering company's logo on the pocket. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she worked quietly, keeping her eyes down. Victoria frowned. "Excuse me," she called out sharply. "The reception starts in 3 hours. Why isn't this room ready yet?" The woman looked up, her expression calm. "I'm just finishing up, ma'am." There was a small spill from one of the flower arrangements. "Well, hurry up," Victoria said. "And make sure you're not visible during the ceremony or reception. I don't want the help showing up in my wedding photos." The woman nodded silently and continued working. Victoria walked around the ballroom, checking the table settings and decorations. She stopped when she noticed the woman was still in the same corner. "Are you slow or something?" Victoria asked, placing her hands on her hips. "I need this room perfect in the next 30 minutes. My guests will want to see someone like you when they arrive." The older woman straightened up slowly, her dignity intact despite Victoria's rudeness. "I understand, ma'am. I'll be done shortly." "People like you should know their place," Victoria continued, enjoying the feeling of power. "Robert's family has standards. This isn't some cheap motel cleaning job." Just then, the doors to the ballroom opened, and Robert walked in. He was tall and handsome in his tailored suit, his dark hair perfectly styled. But when he saw the scene before him, his smile disappeared. "Mom," he said, looking at the woman in the gray uniform. "What are you doing here? I thought you weren't coming until later." Victoria's heart stopped. She looked from Robert to the woman, suddenly understanding the terrible mistake she had made. "Your mother?" Victoria whispered, her face growing pale. "This is your mother?" Robert hurried across the room and gently took the cleaning supplies from the woman's hands. "Victoria, this is Eleanor Wilson, my mother." Eleanor Wilson looked at Victoria with kind but knowing eyes, and in that moment, Victoria knew her perfect wedding day had just become something else entirely. Victoria stood frozen, her mouth slightly open. The ballroom suddenly felt too warm as she looked between Robert and Eleanor. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Robert spoke. "Mom, you weren't supposed to be working today," Robert said gently, taking the cleaning cloth from Eleanor's hands. "We talked about this." Eleanor smiled at her son, patting his cheek affectionately. "I know, dear, but Maria called in sick, and they needed extra help. I didn't want to leave them short-staffed for such an important event." Victoria's mind raced frantically. How could this be happening? Robert had told her his mother was a retired teacher who now volunteered at community centers. He had never mentioned that she worked as a janitor. And why hadn't she met Eleanor before now? Robert had always made excuses when Victoria suggested visiting his mother, saying she was busy or traveling. "I don't understand," Victoria finally managed to say. "You're Robert's mother? But you're—" She stopped herself before saying something even worse. Eleanor looked directly at Victoria, her expression calm but serious. "Yes, I am Robert's mother. And yes, I work for the catering company that handles events at this estate. I've worked here for 15 years. Robert put his arm around his mother's shoulders. "Mom has always worked hard. She raised me by herself after my father died when I was 8. She took any job she could find to make sure I had everything I needed. Victoria felt sick. The diamond bracelet on her wrist suddenly felt too heavy, and her expensive dress too tight. All the cruel words she had said just moments ago echoed in her head. "But your family," Victoria stammered, looking at Robert. "The Wilsons are one of the oldest families in town. This estate belongs to my uncle, my father's brother," Robert explained. "We share the Wilson name, but not the fortune. My uncle was kind enough to let us use the estate for the wedding as his gift to us." Eleanor straightened her uniform. "I should get back to work," she said. "There's still much to do before the guests arrive." "No, Mom," Robert said firmly. "You're a guest today, not staff. Go home and change into your dress. I'll explain to the catering manager." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "All right then, I'll see you both at the ceremony." She turned to Victoria and added, "It was nice to finally meet you, Victoria. Robert has told me so many good things about you." The kindness in Eleanor's voice made Victoria feel even worse. As Eleanor walked away, Robert turned to his fiancée, disappointment clear in his eyes. "Why would you speak to anyone that way, Victoria, let alone someone working hard to make our day special?" Victoria couldn't meet his gaze. "I didn't know she was your mother." "That shouldn't matter," Robert said quietly. "Would it have been okay to speak that way if she was just an ordinary worker? Is that who you are?" Victoria had no answer. All her life, she had been raised to believe that her family's money made her better than others. She had learned to look down on people who worked in service jobs. Now, standing in her expensive wedding dress, she felt smaller than she ever had before. "I need to speak with my mother," Victoria finally said, "to apologize." Robert nodded. "Yes, you do. And not just because she's my mother, but because it was wrong." As Robert walked away, Victoria realized that in just a few minutes, everything had changed. The perfect wedding she had planned now seemed hollow and meaningless. For the first time in her life, Victoria was forced to look at herself through someone else's eyes, and she didn't like what she saw. Victoria hurried through the mansion's elegant hallways, her wedding dress rustling as she moved. She needed to find Eleanor before she left the estate. Guests would start arriving in less than 2 hours, but nothing seemed important now except making things right. Outside, Victoria spotted Eleanor walking toward the staff parking area. She quickened her pace, nearly tripping on her long dress. "Mrs. Wilson." "Eleanor." "Please wait," Victoria called out. Eleanor turned, surprise crossing her face when she saw the bride running toward her in the full wedding gown. "You'll ruin your beautiful dress," Eleanor said, concern in her voice despite everything. Victoria stopped in front of her, breathing heavily. "I don't care about the dress. I need to apologize to you. What I said was horrible. I'm so ashamed." Eleanor studied Victoria's face carefully, as if trying to determine if her apology was sincere. "Why did you say those things?" The direct question caught Victoria off guard. She expected Eleanor to accept her apology quickly, allowing them both to move past the uncomfortable moment. But Eleanor Wilson wasn't making this easy. Victoria struggled to find the right words. "I was raised to think certain ways about people. My parents always taught me that our status was important." "And you believed them," Eleanor said. "It wasn't a question." Victoria nodded, feeling tears forming in her eyes. "I never questioned it. But that's no excuse for how I treated you." Eleanor sighed deeply, the lines on her face seeming to deepen. "I've cleaned houses and offices for 30 years, Victoria. I've been treated badly many times. Usually, I just ignore it and keep working." "I'm so sorry," Victoria whispered. "But this is different," Eleanor continued. "You're marrying my son. Robert is everything to me. I worked 3 jobs to put him through college. I went without so he could have opportunities." Victoria felt each word like a physical blow. She had never considered what it might be like to struggle. Her own parents had paid for her expensive private education without a second thought. "Robert never told me about your work," Victoria said softly. Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. "Are you saying you wouldn't have married him if you had known?" The question hung in the air between them. Would she have continued dating Robert if she had known his mother was a cleaning woman? Victoria was ashamed to realize she wasn't sure of the answer. "I don't know who I was before today," Victoria admitted. but I know I don't want to be that person anymore. For the first time, Eleanor's expression softened slightly. People can change if they truly want to. Robert must be so disappointed in me, Victoria said, a tear finally escaping down her cheek. My son loves you, Eleanor replied, but love needs respect to survive. He respects where I come from and the work I do. He needs a partner who feels the same way. Victoria nodded, understanding the warning in Eleanor's words. Can I ask you something? Why didn't you tell Robert you were working here today? A small smile crossed Eleanor's face. I didn't want to embarrass him. Or you. I was planning to finish my shift and go home to change before the ceremony. No one needed to know. The selflessness of this act made Victoria feel even worse. Eleanor had been protecting her son's feelings, and by extension, Victoria's, while Victoria had been concerned only with appearances. What happens now? Victoria asked. Eleanor looked at her watch. Now, I go home to change into my mother of the groom dress. And you have a decision to make before your guests arrive. What decision? Victoria asked, though she already knew the answer. Whether the woman who spoke to me in that ballroom is really the woman my son should marry, Eleanor said gently. Then she turned and continued walking to her car, leaving Victoria alone with her thoughts. Hashtag. Victoria stood alone in the bridal suite, staring at her reflection without really seeing it. Her makeup artist and hairstylist had finished their work an hour ago, and her bridesmaids were busy taking photos in the garden. In just 45 minutes, she was supposed to walk down the aisle and marry Robert. But all she could think about was the look on Eleanor's face when she had insulted her. And worse, the disappointment in Robert's eyes afterward. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, Victoria called, expecting one of her bridesmaids. Instead, Robert entered, looking handsome in his tuxedo. I know it's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding, he said, but I think we need to talk. Victoria nodded, her heart pounding. Is your mother here? She's in one of the guest rooms, getting ready, Robert answered. He moved further into the room but kept his distance. Victoria, I need to understand what happened earlier. Victoria took a deep breath. I was horrible to your mother. There's no excuse for it. But there is a reason, Robert pressed. You wouldn't have spoken that way without believing it was acceptable. I need to know if that's who you really are. The question hummed between them, heavy with implications for their future. My parents raised me to believe that our social position was everything, Victoria said slowly. They taught me that people who worked certain jobs were less than us. Saying it out loud made her cringe. I never questioned it until today. Robert's expression remained serious. My mother has cleaned offices and houses my entire life. Sometimes she worked 16 hours a day when I was growing up. Every opportunity I've had came from her hard work. I didn't know, Victoria whispered. Because I didn't tell you, Robert admitted. At first, I was afraid you might look down on us. Then, when we got serious, I convinced myself it didn't matter, that you loved me for who I am. Tears formed in Victoria's eyes. I do love you. But would you have continued dating me if you had known about my background from the beginning? Robert asked directly. Victoria wanted to lie, to say of course she would have, but she owed him the truth. I don't know, she admitted, tears now flowing freely. The person I was 6 months ago, probably not. But the person I am now, after loving you and knowing you, that person would choose you no matter what. Robert took a moment to absorb her words. People can change, Victoria, but it has to be real, not just words to save a wedding. Victoria moved to the window, looking out at the elaborate flower arrangements and rows of white chairs where guests were already being seated. All of this, she said, gesturing to the expensive decorations, means nothing if there's no respect between us, between our families. She turned back to Robert. Can I speak with your mother again? Before we decide anything? Robert nodded. She's in the blue room down the hall. Victoria wiped her tears, careful not to ruin her makeup, more out of habit than genuine concern. Thank you. When Robert left, Victoria took a moment to gather her courage. Then she walked down the hallway to the blue guest room and knocked gently. Eleanor opened the door, now dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue dress. She looked surprised to see Victoria. May I come in? Victoria asked. Eleanor stepped aside, allowing Victoria to enter. The room was small compared to the bridal suite, but comfortable. "You look beautiful," Eleanor said kindly. Victoria felt a fresh wave of shame at the older woman's graciousness. "So do you. Robert is lucky to have you as his mother." Eleanor smiled slightly. "What can I do for you, Victoria? The ceremony starts soon." Victoria took a deep breath. "That's what I wanted to talk about. Before I walk down that aisle, I need to know if you can ever forgive me, and if you think I deserve to be your son's wife." Eleanor's expression grew serious as she considered Victoria's question, the weight of the moment settling between them as guests continued to arrive outside. Eleanor gestured for Victoria to sit on the small love set by the window. The older woman took a seat in the armchair across from her, smoothing her navy dress carefully. Outside, they could hear the gentle music starting as more guests arrived. "Forgiveness isn't something you can demand or rush," Eleanor said finally. Her voice was firm but not unkind. "It comes with time and with seeing real change." Victoria nodded, twisting her diamond engagement ring nervously. "I understand. I don't deserve your forgiveness yet." "It's not about deserving," Eleanor replied. "It's about growth. Tell me something, Victoria. Why do you want to marry my son?" The question caught Victoria off guard. She had expected more discussion about her terrible behavior, not this direct question about Robert. "I love him," she said automatically. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Many people love each other. That's not always enough for a lifetime together." Victoria took a moment to really think about the question. "Robert is different from anyone I've ever known. He's kind without expecting anything in return. He sees people, really sees them, and he makes me want to be better than I am." Eleanor nodded slowly. "That's his father in him. My husband was the same way before we lost him. Robert told me his father died when he was young. I'm sorry," Victoria said. "Cancer," Eleanor confirmed. "No health insurance. The medical bills took everything we had, and then some. That's when I started cleaning houses." Victoria felt a pang in her chest. Her own father had had a cancer scare 2 years ago, but their excellent insurance had covered everything. The difference in their experiences was stark. "Robert never told me," Victoria said quietly. "My son doesn't like to talk about hardship," Eleanor explained. "He prefers to focus on possibilities, on what can be, but understanding where someone comes from is important, especially in marriage." Victoria looked down at her elaborate wedding dress, suddenly aware of how much it had cost. More than Eleanor probably earned in months of hard work. "I've lived in a bubble my whole life," Victoria admitted. "I've never had to worry about money or struggle for anything. I didn't even realize how privileged I was until today." Eleanor studied her for a long moment. "Awareness is the first step. But what will you do with that awareness?" Victoria looked up, meeting Eleanor's eyes directly. "I want to learn. I want to understand the world beyond my bubble. And I want to be worthy of Robert's love and your respect." For the first time, Eleanor smiled fully. "That's a good start." "Can I ask you something?" Victoria ventured. "If you were in my place, if you had behaved terribly, and then learned the truth, what would you do now? Would you still walk down that aisle?" Eleanor took her time before answering. "I raised my son to be forgiving, but also to have standards. If you marry him today, you're not just promising to love him. You're promising to grow with him, to see the world through his eyes sometimes, and to respect the journey that made him who he is." "Including respecting you," Victoria added. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "I am part of who Robert is, just as your parents are part of who you are." Victoria thought about her parents sitting in the front row outside, waiting for the ceremony to begin. They had no idea what had happened. They would be shocked to learn that their future daughter-in-law worked cleaning houses. "My parents won't make this easy," Victoria admitted. "They'll be difficult about all this." Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. "Then that's your first test. Will you stand up for what's right, even when it's hard? Even against people you love?" The question hung in the air between them as the wedding music grew louder outside. Time was running out. Victoria would need to make her decision soon. "What should I do?" Victoria asked, barely above a whisper. Eleanor stood up, straightening her dress. "That's not for me to say. Whatever you decide, make sure it's something you can live with for the rest of your life." Victoria walked slowly back to the bridal suite, Eleanor's words echoing in her mind. Through the windows, she could see that nearly all the guests had arrived. The string quartet played softly, and flower-adorned chairs stood in perfect rows on the lawn. Everything looked exactly as she had planned it. Yet nothing felt the way she had expected on her wedding day. When she reached the bridal suite, her bridesmaids were waiting, champagne glasses in hand. "There you are," exclaimed Melissa, her maid of honor. "We were starting to worry. Your father will be here in 10 minutes to walk you down the aisle." Victoria managed a small smile. "Could you all give me a few minutes alone? I need some time to think." The bridesmaids exchanged concerned glances. "Pre-wedding jitters?" asked Tiffany, her cousin. "That's totally normal." "I'm fine," Victoria assured them. "I just need a moment." After they left, Victoria sank into a chair and closed her eyes. For the first time in her life, she was truly seeing herself clearly. The image wasn't flattering. She had been shallow, judgmental, and cruel, not just today to Eleanor, but in countless small ways throughout her life. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Her father, James Green, entered the room in his expensive tuxedo. His smile faded when he saw her expression. "What's wrong, princess?" he asked. "Having second thoughts?" Victoria looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw the arrogance in his posture, the dismissive way he regarded anything he considered beneath him. She had learned her attitudes from somewhere, after all. "Dad, I need to tell you something," Victoria said. "Robert's mother works as a cleaner. She was actually working here today, preparing for the wedding." James stared at her for a moment, then laughed. "That's a joke, right? The Wilsons are one of the oldest families in town. Robert's uncle is wealthy. Robert and his mother are not," Victoria explained. "She worked hard all her life to give Robert opportunities." Her father's expression darkened. "And he never told you this before now? On your wedding day?" "He tried to," Victoria admitted. "I just never wanted to hear it. I was too busy planning the perfect wedding to listen to what really mattered." James paced the room, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "This changes things, Victoria. The Green family has standards to maintain, our social circle." "Stop," Victoria said firmly. "Just stop, Dad. Listen to yourself." Her father looked shocked at being interrupted. Victoria continued. "Today I said terrible things to a woman just because she was cleaning floors. I judged her without knowing anything about her. And it turns out she's one of the strongest, most dignified people I've ever met." Victoria. "No, Dad. I need you to understand something. If I marry Robert today, I'm also welcoming Eleanor into my life, not as someone beneath me, but as family. As an equal." James Green's face reddened. "I won't allow this embarrassment. What will people say?" "That's exactly the problem," Victoria said sadly. "All my life, I've worried about what people will say instead of what's right." She stood up and walked to the window, watching the guests chatting in their expensive clothes, completely unaware of the drama unfolding inside the house. "The ceremony starts in 5 minutes," her father said stiffly. "You need to decide what you're doing." Victoria turned to face him. "I already have." She picked up her phone from the dressing table and sent a text to Robert. Asterisk, "Can you meet me in the garden behind the kitchen? Just you. It's important, asterisk." After sending the message, she looked at her father. "I love Robert. I want to marry him. But not like this, not with these lies between us. I need to fix things first." Her father stared at her in disbelief. "You can't be serious. 300 guests are waiting." Victoria took a deep breath. "Then they'll have to wait a little longer." With that, she gathered her dress and walked past her stunned father, heading toward the garden where she hoped Robert would be waiting. Victoria waited nervously in the small garden behind the kitchen. This quiet spot, hidden from the main ceremony area, was where the kitchen staff took their breaks. Simple wooden benches sat under an old oak tree, far less grand than the elaborate decorations out front. Her heart pounded as she heard footsteps approaching. Robert appeared, looking confused and concerned. When he saw Victoria in her wedding dress, standing among the herb garden and practical plantings, he stopped. "Victoria, what's going on? Everyone's waiting." She took a deep breath. "I know, and I'm sorry for that, but I needed to talk to you away from everyone else." Robert approached cautiously. "You're scaring me. Are you calling off the wedding?" Victoria shook her head. No, not exactly, but I can't walk down that aisle until we're honest with each other. She gestured for him to sit beside her on one of the simple benches. When he did, she took his hands in hers. I spoke with your mother, Victoria said. She helped me see things I've been blind to my whole life. Robert waited silently for her to continue. I've been living in a bubble, Robert. A bubble where people are judged by their bank accounts and job titles. Where someone who cleans houses is considered less important than someone who owns houses. She squeezed his hands. I'm ashamed of how I spoke to your mother. But I'm even more ashamed that it took this incident for me to recognize who I've become. Robert's expression softened slightly. People make mistakes, Victoria. This wasn't just a mistake, she insisted. It was a reflection of who I am, or who I was. My father just came to see me, and when I told him about your mother, he wanted me to cancel the wedding. Robert's jaw tightened. I see. But that's not what I want, Victoria said quickly. I don't want to be that person anymore. I don't want to care about status or what people think. She looked around at the simple garden, then back at the man she loved. I want to marry you, Robert, but I want to do it right. What does that mean? He asked. Victoria took another deep breath. It means I want to start over. I want to postpone today's ceremony. Robert looked shocked. Postpone? There are 300 people waiting right now. I know, Victoria said, and they can all go enjoy the reception without us. The food is paid for, the band is ready. Let them eat cake. Despite the tension, Robert smiled slightly at her joke. Victoria continued, I want us to get married, but in a way that honors your mother and what she did for you. Not this extravagant show I plan to impress people who don't really matter. She looked into his eyes. I want time to get to know Eleanor properly, to understand your life before me, and to become someone worthy of both of you. Robert was quiet for a long moment. You understand what you're suggesting? The gossip, the embarrassment? I do, Victoria said firmly. And for the first time in my life, I don't care about any of that. I only care about doing what's right. Robert studied her face. This is real, isn't it? You're really changing. I'm trying, she admitted. I won't get it perfect right away, but I want to try, every day, to be better than I was yesterday. Robert stood, pulling Victoria to her feet. Then I think we need to tell our guests there's been a change of plans. Victoria felt a wave of relief wash over her. You're not angry. I'm surprised, he said honestly. But no, I'm not angry. I'm actually proud of you. Victoria felt tears forming in her eyes. There's just one more thing. What's that? Robert asked. Your mother. I'd like her to be part of this decision. To know that I respect her enough to include her in this moment. Robert smiled fully now. I think she's going to be very surprised by the new Victoria Green. Victoria adjusted her veil. So am I. But I think I might like her better than the old one. Hand in hand, they walked back toward the house, ready to face their guests and families with their unexpected announcement. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, Victoria was choosing the right path instead of the expected one. 6 months had passed since the day of the almost wedding. On a clear Saturday morning, Victoria stood in the backyard of Eleanor's modest home, helping to set up folding chairs on the small but well-kept lawn. The space was nothing like the grand estate where her first ceremony was planned, but Victoria found she preferred the warmth and simplicity of this setting. Is this row straight enough? Victoria asked, stepping back to examine her work. Eleanor came out of the house carrying a tray of lemonade. It looks perfect, dear. Come take a break. You've been working all morning. Victoria smiled and joined her future mother-in-law on the small porch. The relationship between them had grown slowly but steadily over the past months. Victoria had made a point of visiting Eleanor at least twice a week, sometimes helping with household chores, other times just talking and listening to stories about Robert's childhood. Are you nervous about tomorrow? Eleanor asked, handing Victoria a glass of lemonade. Not about marrying Robert, Victoria replied honestly. Just about seeing some of my old friends again. The guest list for this wedding was much smaller, only 50 people instead of 300. Many of Victoria's society friends had dropped away after the scandal of the postponed wedding. Some had been openly cruel about her choice to embrace Robert's common background. True friends accept you as you are, Eleanor said wisely, and they support you when you're trying to grow. Victoria nodded. I've learned who my real friends are, and I've made new ones. That was true. Through volunteering at the community center where Eleanor spent her Sundays, Victoria had met people she would never have associated with in her previous life. People who judged her by her actions, not her bank account. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway interrupted their conversation. Robert stepped out, carrying grocery bags. The flowers will be delivered at 9 tomorrow, he announced as he joined them on the porch. And I picked up the ingredients for Mom's famous punch. Eleanor beamed with pride. I'll start making it this evening. Victoria watched them with a full heart. 6 months ago, she could never have imagined feeling so content in this simple setting, planning a backyard wedding with homemade decorations and food prepared by friends and family. Your parents called, Robert said to Victoria, his tone cautious. They wanted to confirm what time they should arrive. Victoria tensed slightly. Her relationship with her parents had been strained since the day she had walked away from the lavish wedding. For months, they had refused to speak to her, believing she had embarrassed the family. It was only recently that they had begun making tentative steps toward reconciliation. Did they sound okay? Victoria asked. Robert nodded. Your mother asked if she could bring anything. I told her just themselves. That's progress, Eleanor said gently. Give them time. Victoria smiled gratefully. If anyone understood the importance of family, it was Eleanor. As evening approached, more family members arrived to help with preparations. Robert's cousins, Eleanor's sister, and a few close friends all worked together, hanging string lights in the trees and setting up the small arch where the ceremony would take place. Later, as Victoria and Robert walked hand in hand around the yard, admiring their work, Victoria stopped suddenly. What is it? Robert asked. I was just thinking about how different this is from what I originally planned, Victoria said, and how much happier I am with this. Robert squeezed her hand. No regrets? Victoria looked around at the modest home, the simple decorations, and the people who truly cared about them. She thought about the journey of the past 6 months. The difficult conversations, the tears, the growth, and most importantly, the love she had found in this family that valued character over wealth. Not a single one, she answered truthfully. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be. As the sun set over Eleanor's small house, Victoria knew that her wedding tomorrow wouldn't be featured in any society pages. There would be no crystal chandeliers or gourmet 7-course meals. But there would be honesty, respect, and true love, not just between her and Robert, but within their entire blended family. And that, Victoria had learned, was worth more than all the diamonds in the world.